How good was Bobby Heenan? That is the question. And the answer, depending on who you ask, might genuinely stop you cold. Some people will tell you he was just a funny man at ringside. They will say he never held a world title. They will say he spent most of his career standing outside the ropes instead of fighting inside them. They will say he was more of a comedian than a serious performer. And on the surface, if you did not know any better, that argument almost sounds reasonable. Almost. But here is where the story gets interesting. If you enjoy content like this, use the hype feature right now. It takes 2 seconds and helps more than you know. Now let's get into it. The biggest names in the history of professional wrestling do not agree with that dismissive version of events. Not even close. Ric Flair does not agree with it. Hulk Hogan does not agree with it. Jim Ross, Triple H, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, and Bret Hart do not agree with it. And these are not casual observers. These are the men who were there. The men who worked with him, competed against him, sat next to him in a commentary booth, and watched firsthand as he did things that very few performers in this or any other era could replicate. When these legends were asked about Bobby Heenan, they did not give polite, lukewarm answers. They gave answers that made people stop and rethink everything they thought they understood about what Heenan was doing and why it mattered so deeply. This video is going to take you through all 8 of those perspectives. We are going to go through them in a specific order, building from one idea to the next, counting down from number 8 all the way to number 1. Because the story gets bigger and bigger the deeper you go. We are going to talk about comedy and psychology. We are going to talk about sacrifice and selflessness. We are going to talk about the kind of heat that gets you a police escort out of an arena. And we are going to talk about a single night in 1992 that a lot of people call the greatest performance of its kind in wrestling history, and the role Heenan played in making it feel that enormous. But before all of that, you need to understand something important about who Bobby Heenan actually was. Because most people only ever saw one piece of the picture. Think about what it takes to be great at even one job. Most people spend entire careers trying to master a single skill. A boxer works on footwork and timing. A broadcaster works on the rhythm of a live show. Most people get one lane, and even then, many never fully get there. Bobby Heenan was exceptional at 4 lanes at the same time. He was a manager, he was a wrestler, he was an interviewer, and he was a broadcaster. In all 4 roles, the people who knew the industry best did not just call him good, they called him the greatest. That is not a minor claim. Professional wrestling has produced some of the most versatile performers in the history of entertainment. People who could talk and fight and perform and connect with audiences in ways that went far beyond what most traditional sports could offer. And yet, within that world, Heenan stood apart. Not because he was the loudest or the most physically gifted in the room, but because he understood the architecture of the whole thing in a way that very few others ever did. He understood that professional wrestling was not just about who could hit hardest or move fastest. It was about story. It was about making an audience feel something so deeply that they could not look away. And the real way you do that is not just by building heroes. It is by building villains who are so convincing, so infuriating, so completely dedicated to their role that the audience would do almost anything to see them finally get what they deserve. That was Bobby Heenan. That was his craft. And the proof of that craft is in the words of the legends who watched it up close. We are counting down 8 of them, starting now. Number 8 is Bret Hart. Bret Hart is not someone who throws around compliments easily. He is widely known as one of the most technical, precise, and demanding performers in the history of the sport. When Bret Hart says something is great, he means it in a very specific and deeply informed way. He is not talking about entertainment value in isolation or crowd noise levels. He is talking about craft. He is talking about whether something holds up when you strip away all the spectacle and look at the pure mechanics underneath. So when Bret Hart called Bobby Heenan pure magic, that is not a casual throwaway statement. That is a technical evaluation from one of the most respected judges of the craft in wrestling history. And what Hart was specifically pointing to was something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the hardest things to pull off in any performance medium. He was talking about the ability to make people laugh and still make them want to see you get punched at the exact same time. Think about how genuinely difficult that balance is. Comedy and threat do not naturally go together. When a character becomes funny, audiences usually start to warm up to them, or at least feel less hostile toward them. The laughter softens the edges of the character. The tension drops. And in professional wrestling, if the tension around the villain drops, the entire story loses its power. Heroes become smaller. Matches feel less important. The audience emotionally disconnects from the stakes. This is a real problem that has cut short the effectiveness of many potentially great villains across wrestling history. Heenan solved this problem through a specific kind of comedy that never once asked the audience to root for him. His humor was always rooted in arrogance or cowardice. He was funny because he was delusional about his own greatness, or because he would do anything, including hiding behind his wrestlers or fabricating outrageous injuries to avoid getting what he deserved. These are not traits that make you like someone. They are traits that make you laugh at someone while still wanting to see them face the consequences of their own behavior. That is a completely different emotional experience from being charmed by a character. And Heenan could produce that specific feeling on demand in any arena against any opponent on any given night. Hart also made the point that Heenan's comedy never detracted from the seriousness of what was happening in the ring. It actually enhanced it. That is the real genius. Most performers have to choose between being funny and being credible. Heenan did not make that choice. He did both, on the same stage, in front of the same audience, without ever breaking the internal logic of who his character was. Bret Hart concluded that there was no one like Bobby Heenan before him, and there would be no one like him again. Coming from the Hitman, with everything that carries, that is about as meaningful a compliment as exists in the wrestling world. Number 7 is Mick Foley. Mick Foley built his entire reputation on one thing above almost all else: sacrifice. He is a man who threw himself off steel structures, allowed himself to be set on fire, and took physical falls that would have ended most professional careers just to give the audience a moment they would never forget. So when Mick Foley talks about selflessness in professional wrestling, he is speaking from a place of personal experience that almost no one else in the history of the business can match. And when Foley identifies Bobby Heenan as one of the most selfless performers he ever witnessed, that carries a weight that deserves to be taken seriously. Here is what Foley was pointing to. In professional wrestling, every story eventually needs a payoff. The audience goes through the journey of watching the villain win, cheat, lie, and cause suffering across weeks and months of storytelling. They build up frustration and genuine anger, and at some point that frustration needs a release. The bad guy has to get what is coming to them. That release is what makes the hero feel like a real hero. Without it, the whole story falls completely flat. In wrestling, the villain getting their comeuppance often means taking a physical beating in front of the audience. And how that moment actually lands depends entirely on how the villain reacts to it. A weak or uninvested reaction from the villain makes the hero look average. A committed and explosive reaction from the villain makes the hero look like $1 million. Bobby Heenan understood this better than almost anyone who ever stood at ringside, and he acted on that understanding every single time. Foley called Heenan a bumping machine. In wrestling, a bump is when you take a fall and react in a way that makes the other person's move look devastating. Most managers did not take bumps. They stood at ringside, looked nervous, occasionally got grabbed by the collar, and stayed safe. Heenan did none of that. He flew over the ropes. He flipped completely onto his face. He tumbled across the arena floor. He made every physical consequence look like the most painful thing that had ever happened. And every time he did it, the crowd erupted. And every time the crowd erupted, the hero of the story looked 10 feet tall. Foley's deeper point was not just that Heenan was physically capable enough to do these things. The point was that Heenan chose to do them, consistently and without complaint, throughout his career. He had the skill to protect himself more carefully. He had the character and the stature to play things much more safely. But he consistently chose to do whatever it took to make every moment bigger for everyone else involved. That is the definition of selflessness in a performance setting. And according to Mick Foley, Bobby Heenan did it better and more consistently than anyone. Number 6 is Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels became one of the biggest stars in professional wrestling history, but there was a point in his career where that was far from guaranteed. He was known as a gifted tag team performer, but the question of whether he could carry the company as a single star was still very much open. And in that critical transition period, Bobby Heenan played a role that Michaels himself pointed to as being genuinely important to how his career developed. Here is what Heenan understood that others sometimes missed. In professional wrestling, the words spoken about a performer often matter just as much as the performances themselves. If the audience hears a respected voice saying, night after night, that a certain performer is special, that they are the future, that they are the most gifted athlete in the building, the audience starts to believe it. They start to look for the evidence to confirm what they are being told. And because Heenan was so convincing, so specific, and so consistent in his advocacy, the audience trusted the message he was delivering. Heenan called Michaels the star of the 90s. He predicted a future championship with complete confidence. He said Michaels was probably one of the most gifted athletes he had ever come across in his time in the business. He described Michaels' arrogance not as a character flaw, but as confidence that was completely and totally justified by the talent on display. Through that framing, night after night, Michaels transformed from a promising young talent into someone the audience could genuinely believe in as a future main event performer. The narrative was being written from the commentary booth as much as it was being written in the ring. Heenan also played a significant role in building the prestige of the Intercontinental Championship during this era. This was not the top title in the company. But through Heenan's relentless advocacy of champions like Mr. Perfect, the Intercontinental Belt became known as the Workers' Belt, the championship held by the most technically gifted and most genuinely skilled performers in the business. It had real value. It had story behind it. It had weight. And that weight transferred directly to the performers who held it or chased it, including a young Shawn Michaels, who was still proving himself on that stage. Michaels summed up the entire dynamic in one clean line that could not be more direct. He said that if you were with Bobby, you were important. That is the impact of a manager who understood that his job was not to chase championships for himself, but to make everyone he believed in feel like they absolutely deserved one. Number 5 is The Undertaker. The Undertaker is one of the most carefully protected characters in the history of professional wrestling. For decades, he maintained an aura of dominance and mystery that very few performers across any era have ever been able to sustain at that level. He is not someone who throws praise around carelessly. When The Undertaker speaks about another performer's ability, he is making a statement that carries the full weight of his reputation behind it. What The Undertaker recognized in Bobby Heenan was something that goes to the absolute foundation of what makes professional wrestling function. He recognized Heenan's ability to generate what the industry calls heat. For anyone who may not be familiar with that term, heat is the genuine anger and hostility of the crowd directed at the villain. Not mild boredom, not polite disapproval, not casual indifference. Real, boiling, visceral hatred that fills an arena from floor to ceiling and makes the air itself feel charged with emotion. Heat matters enormously because it is the primary fuel that powers the hero's story. A hero is only as impressive as the obstacle they are forced to overcome. And if the villain cannot generate real and convincing heat from the audience, the obstacle feels small and the hero's eventual victory feels hollow. Heenan was, according to The Undertaker, the ultimate antagonist. He could make 30,000 people in an arena want to genuinely harm him with just a single look across the building. Not a lengthy speech, not an elaborate plot or scheme, just a look. And here is where it becomes genuinely serious. The Undertaker was not speaking in theatrical terms or exaggerating for effect. The heat that Heenan generated was sometimes so intense that it crossed the line from theatrical anger into something that felt genuinely dangerous. The Heenan family, his managed group of wrestlers, regularly required police escorts just to leave arenas safely. Not as part of the show, not as a performance element, because the crowds were that angry. Because Heenan had done such a complete job of convincing them that he was a legitimate source of their frustration, that the line between what was real and what was performance blurred for thousands of people simultaneously. That is an extraordinary achievement, and it is also an extraordinary commitment to a role, because generating that level of heat means staying in character with absolutely no breaks, no moments of goodwill toward the crowd, no softening of the edges. It means being willing to absorb the full force of an entire arena's anger and channel it into making every hero who faced you into a bigger star. The Undertaker saw exactly what Heenan was doing, and understood why it required a level of discipline and courage that most performers never had to face. Number 4 is Triple H. Triple H has spent his career in professional wrestling in nearly every capacity that exists. He has been a top-level performer in the ring. He has been an executive who shaped the direction of the entire company. He has studied the business of wrestling with an intensity that very few people in any industry ever apply to their own craft. So when Triple H makes a judgment about the value of a career choice, he is not speaking from a casual or uninformed place. He is speaking from a deep and hard-earned understanding of what it costs to choose one path over another and what the full consequences of that choice mean for everyone involved. His perspective on Bobby Heenan centers on one specific and genuinely remarkable fact. Heenan had everything required to be a world champion in professional wrestling. The physical look, the athletic ability, the promotional skills to sell tickets and connect with audiences, the charisma to command a room from the moment he entered it. In any territory during any point of his peak years, he could have pursued the top championship and based on what the people closest to the business observed, likely achieved it. That was not a fantasy or wishful thinking. That was a realistic path that genuinely existed. He did not take it. Instead, he chose the role of manager. And Triple H's central point is that this was not a failure of ambition or a settling for something less. It was an act of real understanding about where his maximum value lay. Heenan recognized that a great wrestler can carry a single match. They can take an audience on a journey for 30 or 60 minutes and deliver something memorable that people will talk about for years. But a great manager can carry an entire roster at the same time. A great manager provides the emotional foundation that makes a dozen different storylines all work simultaneously. A great manager becomes the single focal point of antagonism that allows wrestlers across every level of the card to benefit from the audience's investment in the overall story. By choosing to be the manager the promotion needed rather than the champion he personally could have been, Heenan multiplied his value many times over. Every member of the Heenan family benefited. Every hero who faced them benefited. Every match that carried his name benefited. Triple H called this true greatness, and it is hard to argue when you look at the scale of the impact. Heenan chose collective elevation over personal accolades, and the industry was significantly better for it in ways that a championship reign, no matter how prestigious, could never have replicated. Number 3 is Jim Ross. Jim Ross is the voice of professional wrestling's most successful era. He was behind the microphone for some of the most significant moments in the history of the industry. He studied broadcasting with the same seriousness that elite athletes apply to their training. He is not someone who identifies a gold standard lightly, and Jim Ross called Bobby Heenan the gold standard of color commentary. The specific detail he kept returning to was what became known among insiders as the no-notes standard. During 3-hour live broadcasts, sometimes in front of enormous pay-per-view audiences, Heenan performed without a single written note in front of him. He did not have a prepared cheat sheet. He did not have a list of talking points. He did not have a rundown of things to say when a specific performer entered the match or a specific moment unfolded in the ring. What he had was mastery, total, complete, internalized mastery of every performer, every storyline, every character dynamic, and every crowd reaction pattern that might come up during a broadcast. He could react to anything that happened in real time with perfect timing and perfect instinct. He could make a joke during a slow moment in a match without once interrupting the natural rhythm of the action. He could provide insight into a wrestling technique without making the audience feel like they were sitting through a clinical demonstration. He could shift from pure comedy to genuine urgency without any visible seam showing between the two modes. Ross also specifically pointed to the partnership between Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon as the definitive blueprint for commentary chemistry in professional wrestling. Monsoon played the role of the credible, legitimate, athletic voice of reason. He was the straight man. He was the one who respected the competition and took the sport seriously. Heenan played the delusional, completely committed advocate for his side. He was the comedian. He was the one who treated every rule as a suggestion and every opponent as an obstacle to be insulted. Together, they created something that felt less like a professional broadcast and more like a genuine friendship between two people who agreed on almost nothing but genuinely cared about each other anyway. That combination, that specific and irreplaceable chemistry, became the template the entire industry has been attempting to recreate ever since. The no-notes detail matters more than it might appear. It was not a trick. It was the result of a complete investment in the world he was describing. Heenan did not need notes because that world was not foreign territory. It was his world. He had wrestled in it. He had managed in it. He had lived every corner of it for decades. When you know something that deeply, you do not need reminders. You just speak. Number 2 is Hulk Hogan. For a decade or more, Bobby Heenan was the primary obstacle in Hulk Hogan's professional wrestling life. On screen, they were bitter enemies. Heenan's stable of managed wrestlers existed largely to challenge Hogan's dominance and create the conflicts that drove the WWF's most commercially successful storylines. If you only watch the television programs and never look behind the curtain, you might assume Hogan had nothing but contempt for the man who caused him so much on-screen grief. The reality is exactly the opposite. Hogan's off-screen assessment of Heenan is one of the most surprising and genuinely revealing pieces of testimony in this entire countdown. Because Hogan did not simply offer polite professional respect for Heenan, he placed him in the same conversation as the finest technical wrestlers in the entire history of the sport. Specifically, Hogan compared Heenan's in-ring ability to Bret Hart, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Ricky Steamboat. Those 3 names represent a very specific tier of excellence. They are the kind of names that define what technical mastery in professional wrestling looks like. You do not attach those names to someone as a casual courtesy. You attach them to someone when you genuinely believe the comparison is accurate and deserved. Hogan was pointing to a dimension of Heenan's career that most audiences simply never got to fully see or appreciate. Before Heenan became the brain of the WWF, before he became the comedic manager in the sharp suit, standing at ringside with a knowing smirk, he was a legendary wrestler in the American Wrestling Association. He had the complete set of tools. He had the timing. He had the technical understanding of the craft at a physical level that went far beyond what his later managerial persona ever suggested to a general audience. What made Heenan extraordinary in the ring was not power or size. It was what Hogan described as the little things: timing, positioning, selling, the ability to make his opponent look better than they would have looked against almost anyone else. These are the elements that separate genuinely great wrestlers from merely good ones. They are subtle. They do not end up on highlight reels, but the people who spent their careers inside the business can identify them instantly, and Hogan saw them clearly in Heenan every time they shared the same space. The other dimension Hogan highlighted was how Heenan used his position strategically to protect and elevate the wrestlers in his family. By consistently absorbing the full concentrated force of the crowd's anger himself, Heenan allowed performers like Andre the Giant and King Kong Bundy to remain physically imposing and truly threatening figures in the audience's mind. If the crowd's frustration had no single focal point, it would have spread across all the villains and diluted the heat for everyone involved. By being the primary and most visible target himself, Heenan concentrated that energy in a way that made every physical threat in his group feel more dangerous and more significant by direct association. That is a strategic and deeply selfless contribution that most fans watching at home never consciously identified, but felt in every match. Number 1 is Ric Flair. We have built through 7 legends now, and each one has added a distinct and important layer to the overall picture. Comedy without compromise. Selfless bumps that make heroes shine brighter. The power of words to create genuine importance in the eyes of an audience. The danger and total discipline required to generate real heat. The sacrifice of personal glory in exchange for collective success. The mastery of a 3-hour live broadcast without a single written note. The hidden and largely unseen brilliance of the most sophisticated in-ring technician that most people did not realize they were watching. All of those layers converge in the story that Ric Flair tells, because the 1992 Royal Rumble is the event that most clearly demonstrates what Bobby Heenan was capable of when he had a stage large enough to show everything at once. The 1992 Royal Rumble is consistently cited as the greatest version of that match in its entire history. Ric Flair entered at number 3, which meant he had to survive inside the ring, while 29 other wrestlers entered after him, each one trying to eliminate him by throwing him over the top rope. He lasted over 60 minutes from start to finish. He absorbed everything the match threw at him. He found a way to survive every elimination attempt. And when it was finally over, he had won the vacant WWF World Heavyweight Championship. It remains one of the most remarkable individual endurance performances in the history of the sport. But here is what Flair himself has consistently maintained. The match would not have been what it was without Bobby Heenan working on commentary alongside Gorilla Monsoon. Think carefully about what Heenan was actually doing during those 60-plus minutes. He was not simply watching and describing a match to the audience. He was living it. Every time a new opponent entered the ring, Heenan's anxiety was completely audible. Every time Flair came dangerously close to elimination, the desperation in Heenan's voice was real and visceral. Every time Flair survived another threatening situation, Heenan's relief and vindication exploded out of him with full force. He was not providing a commentary track. He was experiencing the entire event in real time alongside the audience, at full emotional volume, for an hour straight, without ever losing the thread of the narrative he was building. This approach was built on a sophisticated and deliberate understanding of how great commentary actually functions. Heenan knew that his job was not simply to describe what was visually happening in the ring. His job was to tell the audience what to feel about what was happening. And to do that effectively over the full length of that match, he had to stay completely committed to his character and his perspective without any softening or breaking of the performance. Part of that commitment involved a very careful psychological strategy worth understanding in full. Heenan would never offer a genuine criticism of any babyface, any hero in the match, that could actually damage that performer's reputation with the audience. He had no interest in genuinely harming anyone's professional standing. So instead, he used exaggerated, obviously character-based insults that were funny and outrageous, but never truly damaging to the professional integrity of anyone involved. Claiming a wrestler was slow or questioning someone's intelligence in theatrical, over-the-top terms was not real criticism. It was performance. And by keeping his attacks firmly in the realm of obvious exaggeration, he maintained his heel voice without doing any actual harm to the people he was technically mocking. Fair to Flair was not just a catchphrase that people remember fondly. It was a narrative anchor that forced the audience to engage with Flair's importance in a direct and active way. It required them to respond to the argument being made, even if that response was disagreement and frustration. And because Heenan was making the argument with absolute sincerity and total unwavering commitment, even the audience members who strongly disliked Flair found themselves paying closer attention. That is the specific power of a great advocate. They make you argue back. They make you engage emotionally with the story. And emotional engagement is the most important ingredient in any form of entertainment. Flair also came to the WWF carrying the prestige of the NWA Championship, a title from a competing organization that held enormous respect among serious wrestling fans. Heenan understood this prestige needed to be imported and established for a new audience. So he did not simply manage Flair, he contextualized him. He told the WWF audience, week after week, why Flair was the real world's champion, why his credentials were unmatched, and why every other performer in the WWF was essentially operating in his shadow. It was a deliberate, sustained campaign of narrative positioning that worked precisely as Heenan intended. And here is what brings the entire picture together into one complete idea. Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan were not merely professional partners during the broadcast of the 1992 Royal Rumble, or during any of the years they worked together on television. They were genuine and deeply close friends. Heenan himself acknowledged this and spoke about it openly and with real warmth. And that friendship was the invisible foundation beneath everything their broadcast chemistry produced together. Monsoon was the exasperated, credible voice of sporting reason. Heenan was the relentless, confident, and perpetually delusional advocate for his side. They pushed against each other constantly. They disagreed on essentially everything that happened on screen, but underneath all of it was a real bond that the audience could sense, even when they could not articulate exactly what they were feeling. And that authenticity made every frustrated response from Monsoon land with genuine weight. It made every outrageous claim from Heenan feel like it came from a real and internally consistent place, even when the claim itself was completely absurd. Heenan once noted that the Brain was the best character in the business because people expected a certain kind of behavior from him. They expected the delusion. They expected the creative reinterpretation of events. They expected the confident wrongness, which meant that the character could absorb any stumble, any unexpected moment, and make it fit seamlessly into who the Brain was. He had built a persona so internally consistent and so completely realized that even its flaws and mistakes became part of its appeal. That is a level of character craftsmanship that very few performers in any medium ever achieve. The Heenan-Monsoon partnership became the template for every effective commentary duo that came after it. The credible voice paired with the invested advocate, the straight man and the joker. The person who respects the rules working alongside the person who treats rules as creative suggestions. Every time a commentary team in professional wrestling has generated genuine chemistry since those years, they have been working from the model that Heenan and Monsoon created together. The specific one-liners Heenan was known for, the Heenanisms that wrestling fans still quote with joy decades later, are worth a moment of real appreciation on their own terms. A friend in need is a pest. That single line tells you the entire worldview of the character in 6 words. When a famous incident involving Marty Jannetty and a window occurred on screen, Heenan instantly reframed it as an act of cowardice on Jannetty's part, rather than an act of aggression against him. When Hulk Hogan pointed to the crowd in his iconic pre-match gesture, Heenan suggested he was simply demonstrating how high he could count. Every one of these moments does the same precise thing. It takes a situation the audience has already interpreted one way and offers a completely opposite interpretation, delivered with total and unshakable confidence. The confidence is what makes it land every single time. Heenan never hedged. He never softened the edge of a line. He said what the Brain would say and let the audience push back with every bit of noise they had. That is the full picture of everything these 8 legends were pointing to when they talked about Bobby Heenan and why he mattered to the business and to all of them personally. They were not simply saying he was talented. They were saying he understood the mechanics of how the whole system functioned better than almost anyone else in the history of the business. He understood that heroes are built by the quality of the resistance placed in front of them. He understood that a manager's greatest achievement is not a personal accolade, but the elevation of the people around them. He understood that comedy, when it is properly rooted in character rather than in crowd-pleasing for its own sake, makes the drama stronger rather than weaker. He understood that performing a 3-hour live broadcast without notes is only possible when you have internalized the world you are describing so completely that speaking about it is as natural as having a conversation. Bobby Heenan passed away in 2017 due to complications from throat cancer after a long and genuinely difficult illness that tested him in ways his career never had. He faced that illness with a version of the same spirit he had brought to everything else in his professional life. The wrestling world mourned him in the way it mourns very few people, with the recognition that the space he had occupied could not simply be filled by whoever came next. The archetypes he created, the financial advisor character, the heel broadcast voice, the bumping manager who made heroes look enormous, continue to shape the way modern performers think about and approach their own roles in the business. Paul Heyman and others who came in the generations after him have drawn clearly and directly from the blueprint Heenan established over decades of work. But the real measure of any performer's legacy is not in the people they influence from a distance or the performers who came after them. It is in the words of the people who were actually there, who stood across from them in arenas, who shared booths with them on live broadcasts, who watched up close as they did the work night after night. Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Jim Ross, Triple H, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, Bret Hart, 8 legends spanning different wrestling styles, different eras, and different roles within the industry, all arriving independently at the same essential conclusion, that Bobby the Brain Heenan was not simply an important supporting figure in the story of professional wrestling. He was one of its most essential architects, a multiplier of talent, a builder of heroes, a standard setter for every broadcaster, every manager, and every performer who followed in his footsteps, and a man whose sophistication, selflessness, and complete mastery of his craft placed him in a category that, as Bret Hart himself said, may genuinely never be occupied by anyone else again. He was never the biggest star in the room, but every big star in the room became bigger because of him. And when you truly understand that, the question stops being how good Bobby Heenan was. The real question becomes whether we will ever see anything like him again. And based on everything these 8 legends said, the honest answer is probably not.